On the morning of November 14th, 1987, a man stood in the cold, watching something he had been certain was impossible. His name was Gerald Hutchins. He was a contractor from Harrisburg. He wore a canvas jacket with his company logo stitched across the back. He had driven 90 minutes through freezing rain to watch a wooden block and tackle lift an 800-pound oak beam into place on the roof of a barn that his 40-ton steel crane had failed to reach. The beam was rising, slowly, steadily, pulled by a system of wooden pulleys and hemp rope that looked like it belonged in a museum. The man operating the system was Samuel King. He was 53 years old. He was Amish. He did not look at Gerald. He simply pulled the rope hand over hand, his breath visible in the November air, and the beam rose 6 inches at a time toward the ridgeline. What Gerald did not know that morning was that he was standing at the end of a story that had begun 22 years earlier, in the spring of 1965, when Samuel's father had hung a leather-bound notebook on a nail in the workshop and told his son never to let anyone open it unless they were willing to learn. That notebook would become the key to everything. What Gerald also did not know was that the steel cable on his crane had snapped not because of the weight, but because of the cold, and that the hemp rope Samuel was using had been soaking in linseed oil for 3 weeks specifically to prevent the same failure. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you about Samuel King, because without understanding where he came from, the rest of this story makes no sense. Samuel was born in 1934 in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. His father, Amish King, was a barn builder. Not a carpenter who sometimes built barns. A barn builder. That was all he did. He had learned the trade from his father, who had learned it from his father, who had come over from Switzerland in 1867 with a set of hand tools and a memory of how timber frames were supposed to lock together without nails. By the time Samuel was old enough to hold a saw, the family had built 47 barns across 3 counties. Every one of them was still standing. Every one of them had been raised using the same system of wooden block and tackle that Amos had inherited and maintained and taught his son to respect. The system was not complicated. It was 6 wooden pulleys, each one carved from ash, mounted in 2 sets of 3. The pulleys were connected by a single continuous rope made from hemp. The hemp was grown locally, twisted into rope, and treated with linseed oil to keep it supple and resistant to rot. The mechanical advantage of the system was 6 to 1. That meant a man pulling with 100 pounds of force could lift 600 pounds. 2 men could lift 1,200. 3 men could lift a ton. The system had no motor, no hydraulics, no electrical components. It could not fail because of a blown fuse or a snapped hydraulic line or a computer error. It could only fail if the wood split, or the rope frayed, or the men pulling it gave up. Amos King had used that system to lift beams that weighed more than half a ton onto barn frames that were 30 feet off the ground. He had done it in summer heat and winter cold. He had done it in rain. He had done it on days when the wind was strong enough to make the beams sway as they rose. He had never dropped a beam. Not once. And he had taught Samuel that the system was not just a tool, it was a test. If you could not lift the beam with the block and tackle, you had no business building the barn. Now let me tell you about the world Samuel grew up in, because this is the key to everything he learned. But before I tell you what happened next, you need to understand the Amish community in 1965. In 1965, the Amish community in Lancaster County was under pressure. Land prices were rising. Developers from Philadelphia were buying up farms. The bishops were meeting every month to discuss whether the GMA could survive if the young men could not afford land. Some families were leaving for Ohio, Indiana, Kentucky, Missouri, where land was cheaper. The ones who stayed had decided that Lancaster was worth fighting for. Amos King was one of them. He owned 60 acres. He had paid off the mortgage in 1953. He told Samuel that as long as they did not owe money to anyone outside the GMA, no one could force them to leave. But the pressure was not just about land. It was also about tools. By 1965, most construction companies in Pennsylvania were using steel cranes, hydraulic lifts, forklifts. Equipment that could do in 10 minutes what it took a crew of Amish men 2 hours to do with ropes and pulleys. The English contractors were faster, louder, everywhere. And they were starting to win bids on projects that Amish builders had been doing for generations. The bishops had made their position clear. Tractors were forbidden. Electricity from the grid was forbidden. Gasoline engines were forbidden except in very specific circumstances. The Ordnung said that the community would survive by staying separate, by refusing to depend on the systems that the English world used to control its people. That meant no debt, no electricity, no machines that tied you to the grid or the bank or the fuel supply chain. Samuel understood the Ordnung. He had been baptized in 1952. He had made his vow. But he also understood that the Ordnung created a problem. If Amish builders could not use cranes, and English builders could, then Amish builders would lose work. And if they lost work, they would lose income. And if they lost income, they would lose land. And if they lost land, the GMA would scatter. So the question was not whether the Ordnung was right. The question was whether it was possible to build as well as the English without using their tools. Amos believed it was. He had spent 30 years proving it. But in the spring of 1965, he was 67 years old. His hands were stiff. His back hurt. He could still pull a rope, but he could not pull it all day. He told Samuel that it was time for him to take over the business. He also told him that the notebook hanging on the nail in the workshop contained everything he needed to know. Samuel asked what was in it. Amos said he would find out when he needed to. The notebook stayed on the nail for 3 years. Samuel built barns the way his father had taught him. He used the block and tackle. He hired crews from the GMA. He underbid the English contractors by 15% because he did not have to pay for crane rentals or fuel or insurance. He won enough work to stay busy, but he did not open the notebook. He did not think he needed to. Then, in the late fall of 1968, everything changed. A contractor from Harrisburg named Gerald won a contract to build a processing facility for a dairy co-op in Intercourse. The facility needed a timber frame. Gerald knew that Amish builders were good at timber frames, so he subcontracted the frame to Samuel. The frame was large, 40 feet by 80 feet. The ridge beam was 32 feet off the ground and weighed 800 pounds. Gerald told Samuel he would provide a crane to lift the beam into place. Samuel said that would not be necessary. He would use his own equipment. Gerald asked what equipment. Samuel said a block and tackle. Gerald laughed. He said a block and tackle could not lift 800 pounds 30 feet in the air. Samuel said it could. Gerald said he would like to see it. Samuel said he would be welcome to watch. The day of the lift was November 12, 1968. It was 28 degrees. The sky was gray. The ground was frozen. Gerald arrived at 7 in the morning with his crew and his crane. The crane was a Link-Belt LS-98. It had a 40-ton capacity. It was painted yellow. It had a diesel engine and a hydraulic boom and a steel cable 3/4 of an inch thick. Gerald positioned the crane next to the frame. He told his crew to attach the cable to the beam. They did. He engaged the hydraulic lift. The boom extended. The cable went taut. The beam rose 6 inches off the ground. Then the cable snapped. It did not fray. It did not stretch. It snapped. The sound was like a gunshot. The beam dropped back onto the supports. The cable whipped through the air and hit the side of the crane with enough force to dent the metal. Gerald shut off the engine. He climbed down from the cab. He walked over to the broken cable and picked up the end. The steel strands were splayed out like the petals of a flower. He stared at it for a long time. Then he looked at Samuel and said he did not understand what had happened. Samuel said the cold had made the steel brittle. Gerald said steel did not get brittle at 28 degrees. Samuel said it did, if it had been flexed too many times. He said the cable had probably been on the crane for 5 years. He said every time it bent around the pulley at the end of the boom, it created microfractures in the steel. He said those fractures did not matter in warm weather because the steel was ductile enough to absorb the stress. But in cold weather, the steel lost its ductility. The fractures became cracks. The cracks became breaks. Gerald asked how Samuel knew that. Samuel said his father had written it down. Now let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever been laughed at for using something your grandfather taught you? Have you ever had someone look at a tool you inherited and tell you it was obsolete, that there was a better way, that you were wasting your time holding on to the past? If you have, then you know what Samuel felt that morning. Gerald asked if Samuel could still lift the beam. Samuel said he could. Gerald asked how. Samuel pointed to the block and tackle hanging from the ridgeline. Gerald looked at it. He looked at the beam. He looked back at Samuel. He said there was no way a wooden pulley system could lift 800 pounds. Samuel said it could lift 1,200 if he had enough men. Gerald said he would pay Samuel double if he could do it. Samuel said he did not need to be paid double. He just needed 3 men and 2 hours. Samuel called over his crew. There were 4 of them, all Amish, all from the Gme, none of them older than 25. He explained what needed to happen. The beam had to be lifted 32 feet and guided into place between 2 vertical posts at the top of the frame. The block and tackle was already rigged. The rope was already threaded through the pulleys. All they had to do was pull. He assigned 2 men to the rope. He assigned 1 man to guide the beam with a pike pole. He assigned the 4th man to watch the pulleys. Then he took his position at the front of the rope and started pulling. The beam rose, slowly, 6 inches, then 12, then 18. The men pulled in rhythm, hand over hand. The rope creaked. The pulleys turned. The beam swayed slightly, but stayed level. Gerald stood 20 feet away with his arms crossed. His crew stood behind him. No one said anything. The beam rose past 10 feet, then 20, then 25. At 30 feet, the man with the pike pole guided it toward the gap between the posts. The beam slid into place. Samuel tied off the rope. The whole process had taken 43 minutes. Gerald walked over to the beam. He put his hand on it. He pushed. It did not move. He looked up at the block and tackle. He looked at the rope. He looked at Samuel. He said he did not understand how it worked. Samuel said it was mechanical advantage, 6-1. Gerald said he knew what mechanical advantage was. He wanted to know why the rope had not broken. Samuel said hemp was stronger than people thought. Gerald said it was not stronger than steel. Samuel said it was not about strength, it was about flexibility. He said steel cable was strong in tension, but weak in fatigue. Hemp rope was weaker in tension, but stronger in fatigue, because the fibers could shift and redistribute the load. He said that was why his father had told him never to use steel cable in cold weather. Gerald asked where Samuel had learned that. Samuel said it was in the notebook. Gerald asked if he could see the notebook. Samuel said no. Let me tell you about that notebook, because this is where the story turns. When Amish King died in 1971, that notebook contained knowledge tested across 3 generations. The notebook was a collection of observations written down over 40 years. Observations about wood. Which species split easily? Which ones held nails? Which ones resisted rot? Observations about rope. How long hemp lasted if treated with linseed oil? How much weight it could hold? How to tell if a rope was about to fail by the sound it made under load. Observations about weather. How cold affected steel. How heat affected wood. And observations about men. How to tell if a crew was getting tired. How to pace a lift. How to know when to stop. Amos had not written the notebook for Samuel. He had written it for himself. It was a way of remembering what he had learned. But after he died in 1971, the notebook became something else. It became a record of what the Gmei had known. Because Amos had not invented these techniques. He had inherited them from his father, who had inherited them from his father, who had brought them from Switzerland. The notebook was 3 generations of knowledge. And Samuel understood that if he lost the notebook, he would lose more than a tool. He would lose a connection. So he kept it on the nail, and he read it when he needed to. When he encountered a problem he did not know how to solve, he would take the notebook down and flip through the pages until he found something that might help. Sometimes it did. Sometimes it did not. But over time he started to see patterns. He started to see that the problems his father had faced were the same problems he was facing. And the solutions his father had found were still the solutions that worked. By 1975, Samuel had built 63 barns. He had used the block and tackle on every one of them. He had never dropped a beam. He had never injured a man. He had never failed to complete a project. And he had never used a crane. The English contractors in Lancaster County knew who he was. Some of them respected him. Some of them thought he was stubborn. A few of them thought he was a fool. But none of them could underbid him. Because Samuel did not have equipment costs. He did not have fuel costs. He did not have insurance costs. He had rope. He had pulleys. He had men. And he had time. Now let me stop here and give you some numbers, because this is where the story turns. That same year, an English contractor 30 miles east had a $40,000 crane and owed the bank $73,000. When the farm crisis hit in the 1980s, he lost everything. Samuel kept building, but time was the one thing the English world did not want to give him. By 1980, construction schedules were getting tighter. Developers wanted buildings finished faster. Contractors were being penalized for delays. The pressure to use cranes was not just about capability anymore, it was about speed. And speed was the one area where Samuel could not compete. A crane could lift a beam in 5 minutes. Samuel needed 45. A crane could be operated by one man. Samuel needed a crew. The bishops started to notice. In 1982, during a GMA meeting, one of the ministers asked Samuel if he had considered using a crane. Samuel said he had not. The minister said that other Amish builders in Ohio were renting cranes from English contractors for large projects. He said it was not a violation of the ordinum as long as the Amish builder did not own the crane or operate it himself. Samuel did not answer right away. He looked at his father-in-law, Jonas, who was sitting 2 benches back. Jonas had been a farmer for 50 years. He had never borrowed money. He had never used a tractor. Samuel looked back at the minister. He said he understood, but he also said he would not do it. The minister asked why. Samuel said because the crane was not the problem. The problem was the schedule. And if he started using cranes to meet English schedules, he would end up dependent on English equipment. And if he became dependent on English equipment, he would eventually become dependent on English money. And if he became dependent on English money, he would lose the one thing that made Amish building different. He would lose the ability to say no. Jonas nodded once. That was all Samuel needed to see. The minister did not argue. But Samuel could tell that some of the men in the GMA thought he was being hochmut, proud, stubborn, unwilling to adapt. He heard the word twice in the next month, once at the auction barn in Intercourse, once at the co-op in Bird in Hand. Both times the men who said it did not say it to his face. They said it to someone else while Samuel was standing close enough to hear. That was how judgment worked in the GMA. It was not confrontation, it was gossip. And gossip was worse than confrontation because you could not defend yourself against it. You could only wait for it to either fade or grow. It grew. By 1983, Samuel noticed the change. At the auction barn, men who used to nod at him now looked past him. The deacon stopped by the farm one evening. He said the GMA was concerned. He said some families were worried that Samuel's stubbornness was bringing pride into the community. Samuel asked if the GMA wanted him to use a crane. The deacon said no. He said the GMA wanted Samuel to consider whether his refusal was about Gelassenheit or about proving something. Samuel did not answer. The deacon left. That night, Samuel sat at the kitchen table with a pencil and paper. His wife, Anna, was mending by lamplight. He was doing the math. He calculated how long they could survive if the work kept declining. 18 months. Maybe 2 years if they sold the south pasture. Anna said if he had to use a crane to keep the land, the G-May would understand. Samuel said if he borrowed money to rent cranes, the land would not really be theirs anymore. Anna asked what he was going to do. Samuel said he did not know yet, but he said he would know by spring. If the work did not come back by spring, he would reconsider. That was the first time Samuel had ever put a condition on his decision. By 1985, Samuel was getting fewer contracts. Not because his work was bad. His work was still the best in the county. But because developers were choosing contractors who could promise faster timelines, and those contractors were using cranes, Samuel's income dropped by 30%, then 40%. He started taking smaller jobs, repairs, additions, work that did not require lifting heavy beams. He did not complain. He did not explain. He just kept working. Then, in the fall of 1987, Gerald Hutchins called. He said he had another project, a barn renovation in Strasburg. The ridge beam needed to be replaced. The beam weighed 800 pounds. The job had to be finished by November 15th, or Gerald would lose the contract. Gerald said his crane could not reach it because the barn was surrounded by trees, and the ground was too soft for the crane to get close enough. He said he had thought about Samuel. He said he remembered the lift in 1968. He asked if Samuel could do it again. Samuel said he could. Gerald said he would pay him $1,500. Samuel said he would do it for $1,200. Gerald asked why. Samuel said because $1,200 was what the job was worth. The day of the lift was November 14th, 1987. The temperature was 31 degrees. The ground was frozen. Gerald arrived with his crew and his crane. He said he wanted to try the crane first. Samuel said that was fine. Gerald positioned the crane as close to the barn as he could. The ground was soft enough that the outriggers sank 4 inches into the mud. He extended the boom. He attached the steel cable to the beam. He engaged the hydraulic lift. The beam rose 3 feet. Then the cable snapped. Gerald shut off the crane. He climbed down. He walked over to Samuel. He said he did not understand. He said the cable was new. He said it was rated for 10,000 pounds. Samuel said the cold had made it brittle. Gerald said it was 31 degrees. Samuel said that was cold enough. He said the boom extension had stressed the cable. He said when you extend a hydraulic boom under load, even before lifting, the cable flexes and creates internal stress points. He said those stress points become weak spots. He said in cold weather, steel loses ductility at those exact weak spots. He said the fractures turned into cracks. He said the cracks turned into breaks. Gerald asked how Samuel knew that. Samuel said his father had written it down. Gerald asked if Samuel could lift the beam. Samuel said he could. Gerald said he would pay him $2,000 if he did it in less than an hour. Samuel said he did not need $2,000. He needed 3 men and 90 minutes. Gerald said the building inspector was coming at 4. It was 2:30. Samuel said that would be enough time. Samuel rigged the block and tackle. He called over his crew. 2 of them were his sons. 1 of them was his nephew. He explained the lift. The beam had to rise 32 feet and slide into place between 2 posts. The block and tackle was already anchored to the ridgeline. The rope was already threaded. All they had to do was pull. He assigned 2 men to the rope. He assigned 1 man to guide the beam. He assigned the 4th man to watch the pulleys. Then he took his position and started pulling. The beam rose. 6 inches. 12. 18. The men pulled in rhythm. The rope creaked. The pulleys turned. Gerald stood with his crew and watched. No one spoke. The beam rose past 10 feet, then 20, then 30. At 32 feet, the man with the pike pole guided it into place. Samuel tied off the rope. The whole process had taken 53 minutes. Gerald walked over to the beam. He put his hand on it. He looked at Samuel. He said he still did not understand how the rope had held. Samuel said it was hemp. Gerald said hemp was not stronger than steel. Samuel said it was not about strength. It was about how the load was distributed. He said hemp fibers could shift under tension. He said that shifting absorbed shock and prevented the kind of catastrophic failure that happened with steel. He said that was why his father had used hemp. He said it was also why he would never use steel cable in cold weather. Gerald picked up a piece of the hemp rope. He ran it through his fingers. He said it felt soft. Samuel said it had been soaking in linseed oil for 3 weeks. Gerald asked why. Samuel said because linseed oil kept the fibers supple. He said supple fibers did not crack. He said fibers that did not crack did not break. Gerald asked where Samuel had learned that. Samuel said it was in the notebook. Gerald asked again if he could see the notebook. Samuel said no. But he said he would tell Gerald what was in it. He said it contained 40 years of observations about building, about wood and rope and weather and men. He said it contained everything his father had learned and everything his grandfather had learned before that. He said it was not a secret. It was just knowledge. And knowledge was only useful if you were willing to learn. Gerald asked if Samuel would be willing to teach him. Samuel said he would not. Gerald asked why. Samuel said because Gerald was not willing to give up the crane. And if he was not willing to give up the crane, then he was not willing to learn what the block and tackle could teach him. Gerald said that did not make sense. Samuel said it made perfect sense. He said the crane made Gerald faster, but it also made him dependent. And dependence was a kind of weakness. He said the block and tackle made him slower, but it also made him free. And freedom was a kind of strength. Gerald did not argue. He paid Samuel $1,200. He loaded his crane onto the trailer. He drove back to Harrisburg. Samuel never saw him again. But 3 weeks later, something unexpected happened. Samuel got a call from a contractor in York. The contractor said Gerald had told him about the lift. He said he had a project that required lifting a beam in a location where a crane could not reach. He asked if Samuel was available. Samuel said he was. The contractor hired him. Then another contractor called. Then another. What Samuel did not know was that Gerald had told them Samuel King was the only builder in Pennsylvania who could work in places where modern equipment could not go. Specialization was worth paying for. By the spring of 1988, Samuel had more work than he could handle, not because he was faster than the English contractors, but because he could do things they could not. Samuel King built barns using the wooden block and tackle until he retired in 2009. 22 consecutive years. In those 22 years, he completed 847 projects. He lifted beams that weighed as much as 1,400 pounds. He worked in heat and cold and rain and wind. He never dropped a beam. He never injured a man. He never used a crane. His average project completion time was 6% longer than contractors who used cranes. His average cost was 18% lower. His safety record was perfect. The notebook is still hanging on the nail in the workshop. Samuel's grandson Eli found it there in 2011. He asked his grandfather if he could read it. Samuel said he could, but he also said that reading it was not the same as understanding it. He said understanding came from using it, from lifting beams and pulling ropes and watching the way the wood flexed and the hemp stretched. He said the notebook was a record, and a record was only useful if you were willing to add to it. Eli is 34 now. He builds barns. He uses the same block and tackle his great-great-grandfather brought from Switzerland in 1867. He has added 6 pages to the notebook. Most of them are about rope. One of them is about the day he lifted a beam in a snowstorm and the hemp rope held when a steel cable would have snapped. He does not know if his son will read the notebook, but he knows it will be there if he does. Sometimes the most radical thing a man can do is refuse to change. Sometimes the tool that has been used for generations is the tool that works best when everything else fails. And sometimes a wooden pulley and a hemp rope hold more knowledge than a 40-ton crane. Samuel King pulled the rope. The beam rose. The English contractor watched, and the old way proved itself one more. If someone in your family left you knowledge instead of money, if they showed you how to build something that lasts, or how to fix what others would throw away, tell me about them in the comments. This is the Plain and Simple Farm.